So Tom, I'm very pleased that you're here in the park in Cologne, Skulptur Park. This is a former private garden. We have wonderful weather, so it's nice wandering around here, cruising around. So tell me about your initial conceptual idea of doing this project here.
Well, as you say, it was the Skulptur Park formerly was a private garden, and I wanted to react to that tension between what was sort of formerly a private area and what's somewhere between still a private space and a public park.
Yeah.
So these mirrored screens that have, I suppose, several different references were meant to be kind of a framing device here. They're meant to sort of talk about audience, talk about landscape, and kind of conflate those two things together.
Okay. So the audience is supposed to do what? Just wandering around, or?
I wanted to create a structure, a series of structures that created a self-consciousness about entering a space like this. And one of the original ideas I had was this 18th and 19th century concept of the black glass,
Yeah.
which was used by French and European generally, but French landscape painters to start to frame and contrive and construct.
They had a portable, mobile frame.
Correct.
Yeah.
They'd have a polished material, could be glass, could be a polished stone, or and they would use it to frame the landscape by holding it this way and seeing the landscape behind them. It would throw it into high contrast and it would give it a frame.
Yeah, and then you turn your view in an image, in a picture.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
But your pieces are sculptures, not paintings.
That's correct.
So Tom, we are here now at the Dan Graham Pavilion. Dan Graham is a big figure in the arts. He was a conceptual artist, a minimal artist, and he does these pavilions. So they are mirrored too, or semi-transparent mirrors. And he was also concerned with the history of the garden. He was an intellectual artist, or he still is an intellectual artist, as you are. So you are writing texts and referring to spaces and sites and the history as well, to the history of the garden, but also to urban history and urban life.
Right. Well, Dan has always been an important figure to me, very specifically and personally, and I consider myself working very much in a kind of trajectory, that Dan is working in. So this location of this pavilion being right here in the park was also an element that I considered very seriously as something that I'm reacting to or responding to or extending. And similarly, if Dan is dealing with issues of the park in relationship to architecture, I'm also trying to sort of deal with that in a different way. Mm-hmm. Less perhaps in terms of a history of specific architecture. I was much more concerned with simply reflecting what's there, simply to try to blankly reflect the surroundings. But obviously I'm articulating that a little bit more specifically than that with the structure of the frames and the X's, and there's certain kinds of almost gestures, series of gestures that take it from being something simply neutral. It's not easy. Looks beautiful.
Oh, isn't it amazing?
I love it.
It's the first time we see it.
I love it. Because I only saw the small section of this, because what it is, it's not glass, obviously. It's polished, stained steel and, with pigment in it, and it has such a strange quality to it, I think.
It's a monitor effect.
Yeah, it does. You don't quite know where you are. The foreground, background is kind of confused, and there's a depth to it that I don't think I would have had with using actual glass.
Yeah, And it relates to your personal perspective, and not just the visual perspective in optics. You reflect where you are.
Right, exactly. I'm very excited to see it also there's a lot of bright sun right now. I'm really curious to see it as all of them are reflecting each other, and reflections reflect reflections, and there's a strange depth within it that I think is going to be pretty fantastic.
You once said it might look like 26 dead iPhones.
26 dead iPhones. Or iPhones that at least aren't turned on. Yeah.
But it's this image or visually or like an imagery like these flat screens.
Right. I think there's just this kind of ubiquitous screen in our lives now, so I'm very interested in screens as a demarcation, as an architectural element, as a physical element, but I'm also interested in the notion of screens that have become part of our bodies and part of our lives. Monitors, what was once the movie screen is now this sort of small black object that's always nearby, and that link, of course, is as trite as it might sound, that link between these handheld devices, small monitors and things, and this earlier device that the painters used and then was picked up by tourism, by people walking and framing the landscape themselves. There's an interesting connection there, I think.
And finally, would look like a graveyard of entirely new objects.
Right, exactly. I think they're kind of somewhere between being obviously sort of technically brand new, physically brand new, and sort of being obsolete. Like their use value is sort of drained on a certain level. And I also think we only have the one here now, but there's going to be a nice relationship between the many, that they're kind of codependent objects, that they can't stand alone. And that's why this sort of linking them to some notion, a pre-existing system like an alphabet made sense to me. It's a sentence, it's not a single word.
This is actually the 8th edition of Skulptur Köln. So it's a sculpture park right here in the center of Cologne, and we have wonderful weather. So I might introduce you to some of my ideas. We have an exceptional permanent collection of artworks. So there are really huge and very well-known artists collected here, like Rosemary Trockel behind me, Sue Fujimoto, built this pavilion, this white and glossy thing in the center of the garden. We spoke about Dan Graham. We have James Lee Byers, a golden sphere up there. There are so many big artists here represented. But the idea of this sculpture garden in Cologne is to have a biennial exhibition in a biennial rhythm into this permanent collection. And that's what I'm in charge of, starting with the show in mid of June, so 14th of June, and then lasting for 2 years. And what I did is I invited a couple of artists, very well-known ones, and I had a certain idea that if you are in this park, it's such a wonderful enclosure. You feel like in a pastoral landscape. Actually, it's an English landscape gardening. But when you listen carefully, you hear the streets, the traffic, the Rhine River. There's a lot of noise. So you have like a landscape, nature in the center of an urban atmosphere, an urban environment. And what I like about the idea of sculptures is a personal, a bodily, a corporal encounter. If you encounter sculpture, then something encounters you. So it's a confrontation of two bodies. One doesn't move and you move. And there's energy going on, energy at work. There's some forces. And this is the idea that made me collect or invite these artists. So you have, for example, Tom Burr. We were talking with him about his pieces. You could see them as a screen, but also as a wall. There's some resistance to it. They are black. And this blackness is important because it's a kind of, an avoidance. I don't want to, but I invite you. And this ambivalence, I like that, And we have certain other artists. For example, there's Lois Weinberger, an Austrian artist, and he just did a scar in the lawn. He digged in a street, so to speak, in the lawn and made it like an injury. And what he did is that he wants the seeds coming through the air and migrate into his street. And he sees this as a metaphor for migration. And the plants who will grow after a while in these or during these 2 years, these plants are for him like metaphors for migrants, because they have to survive with low condition and bad soil, for example, and so on. Because migrants have to live with bad conditions on peripheries, between concrete, between asphalt, between streets, what you hear. So I try to kind of bring in what's outside, but also reflect what is the ambivalence between in and out.